Good morning from the Forex Expo. We're live here in Dubai. I'm Fraser Nelson, the head of business development for Scope Markets, and I'm here with our CEO, Pavel Spirin. We're here to talk about the underdeveloped banking market in MENA and some of the features around it and how it's changing as information. Pavel, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
It's excellent. So one of the things that really strikes me for the MENA market at the moment is that around 48% of the market doesn't have access to the bank. To online banks or actual physical banks. How do you see that in comparative to the rest of the world with your experiences in Europe and Asia?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously a peculiar region in that sense because, I grew up in Europe, and so, banking is something you take for granted. So many people, majority, I don't know what the percent is, probably over 90% have access to some sort of bank account or sort of traditional finance venue. So I think there's obviously, what there has been a period in Europe as well where bank accounts, especially if you're let's say coming to the UK and you want to open a bank account, that was a struggle. You had to have certain, proof of address and a couple of other things. So I think some of it is probably the challenges that, this region is experiencing, something that Europe went through. I think it's a bit kind of like the percent you highlighted, I think is a bit, larger than at least what I'm used to sort of over my lifetime. So I think, so it's kind of I see a bigger divide, and that's a bigger gap, the people not having a bank account.
Of course, 100%. I can remember, you mentioned the UK, I remember being a student going back, and they asked me for KYCs with a proof of address, and my parents lived in Saudi. So I couldn't even open a bank account with wanting to give them money. Is this where you see the angle of not just the digital trading with ourselves and the growth? Is this where you see the digitalization in banking coming and changing the market as well?
I think it's two angles. I think crypto has obviously been quite popular in the region and have recently become quite popular as well, specifically here in the UAE. So I think there will be a greater penetration, from that side of things. And obviously we know crypto has kind of become an alternative venue, to traditional banks. I think that's one angle. I think the second angle is we're seeing sort of some of the global sort of digital banks like Revolut, going and opening offices here. So they got recently, if I'm not mistaken, EMI license. Yeah. There's a signal as well from them to get a bank to the license. So I think these guys have been the catalyst for that kind of account, mass account opening for a lot of the, people that didn't have previously bank accounts with high street banks. So I think, this is the second sort of angle that I see, to expand these services here in the Middle East.
But one of the things you mentioned was Revolut expanding. Obviously in Europe, there are other choices, guys. There's Wise and all of these as well. But, in MENA, I think you obviously see Revolut coming in. You're seeing family offices, funds. You saw Bolsaro put in, I believe, 200 million into the last round of seed funded. Do you see that as maybe Revolut opening as a HQ here or just offering the services? How would you envisage that?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously, Europe has been very successful for them, but, there has been a long period of time when they weren't making money. So it was just sort of, generating revenue, but no profit. I don't know. I think it depends on what the EBITDA from the region shows there. I do think that the demand will be very, very high considering the percentages of people not having a bank account. I do think as well Revolut has crypto offering, and I think that will expand further. Yeah. So I think sort of because the crypto is so much prevalent here, so a lot of the guys that don't have bank accounts are transacting in some way or form, via crypto. Revolut bridging that gap, I think, might produce significant, demand for them. So about moving HQ, I don't know. They just got a license in the UK and they opened, new swanky office there, Canary Wharf. So, so I don't know about that, but I do think that, it's going to have a very high demand over here.
Yeah, I think for me, digitalized banking, you see it in various forms, but I think Revolut, Wise, these kind of companies in the future, they're starting to take very large market share. I mean, for me, the one thing that I see, especially in the MENA region, whether it's from Saudi with the Crown Prince, whether Sheikh Mohammed here in Dubai, the influence of the population here is empowerment of women and getting them into the workplace and allowing. And one thing that really astounded me, that over 60% of most females don't even have their own bank account. Yeah. So I can see that digitalization bringing that equality more in line. Yeah. And also one of the things that really interests me is that, the over 60% of the population in Dubai is under the age of, in the MENA region is under the age of 30. Yeah. And I think we're all moving away from that traditional banking. Myself, I'm a young 40-year-old, but I think I pretty much get my salary paid into a bank. I move it to Revolut. I travel. It's much easier on the exchange rate. So I think you're starting to see that move away from that traditional holding bank. And I think I've been a Lloyd's customer, an offshore and onshore customer for 25 years. And now I don't barely use them because the inflexibility, the lack of the customer support. Yeah. And I think, do you find that with these companies like Revolut and Wise, do you think they're learning from the trading space and these customer support angles in how to penetrate the markets?
I think so. I think it's a great way for, for people that, like, again, don't have a bank account. I think it's a good way for them to kind of like to start with that. But also, like, if we look at Revolut today, cryptocurrencies have access to stock trading. Now they've done a deal with CMC, where that sort of CFD side of things will start coming in as well. But I do think like this market will be very good because if you look at apps like Kareem, the taxi share, the share riding app, the user experience is very similar to what we're used to, like in Europe, for example, Uber and stuff like that. So I do think that there will be like just organic demand for that. And obviously you mentioned the gender divide, between kind of like men and women. I think obviously like the regional specifics, they have to, the region, I guess companies have to tread carefully along the cultural lines here around that. But I do think that, that could have like the process because Revolut, everything is digitized, AI powered, KYC and things like that. So I think it's going to be a lot easier for many people not having to, I don't know what the procedure is exactly, here in UAE, but like I do know that it takes time. Like you need to have a lot of documents. So I do think the demand is going to be high.
I mean, one thing we mentioned there was like obviously the EMI license with the regulatory, the market disparities. These are my kind of areas, but the regulation and that kind of side, I would say is more yours. Are you seeing the local regulators in the MENA region as a whole becoming more adoptive towards these EMI licenses opposed to the traditional licenses as well?
I think so. I think like so far what we have seen, obviously, pretty good uptake in terms of crypto, also, and like relatively friendly regulation in general. So I do think that these sort of innovative, as long as the companies can demonstrate proper due diligence, because where it goes wrong usually is that some new service or new product launches, and then people start complaining that, like they're not getting what they're paying for. I think as long as there is that sort of due diligence done on the side of these companies, I think we're, I don't see issues in, with these types of products and services.
And in terms of the onboarding, obviously the difference between, let's say, Europe and an offshore, do you see the EMI situation becoming more of a European model for the onboarding of the clients, or do you see it becoming a lot more liberalized, like, let's say, some of the offshore banking options that have, like, from Bahamas and these kind of areas? Because traditionally, obviously, you need, as we said, KYC, so you need a proof of identity, proof of address. A lot of some of the offshore ones, if you take Wise, for example, where they're doing through the Bahamas, they're only asking you for a proof of identity. So suddenly it makes it a lot easier for people in the MENA region, let's say, who operate with post boxes or don't have the bills in their name because they're rentals and stuff. Do you see that as a dynamic kind of shift as well?
I think there will be some because, these companies will also have to adapt to the local context. So like if they find that actually they can onboard 60% of the customers because they don't have an address, I think something needs to be done about that. So I think it is more like, to me, like, a lot of the EMIs and, have to work very closely with the regulator over here. And obviously, well, I have experience working a little bit with SISIC, and, like they are like, it's not necessarily you can kind of, convey your point, I guess, across, straight away, but like they do listen. So I think it's sitting down with the regulator, explaining what the challenges are, explaining what the benefits are. And I think ultimately, it's finding smart ways of doing it. Like in Sweden, for example, a lot of the things can be verified by like a bank ID, which is, okay, in this context, maybe it won't work here, but like, everybody has a bank account. And so you can verify you're going to apply for any service with a bank account, essentially. So I feel like applying it to this context, there should be some sort of a database or some way to reference, to identify, because KYC, like, it's not really about ID and your address. It's about, like, basically proving that you are who you say you are.
Of course, it's more the AML side. It's protecting it, making sure there's no money laundering or any of these things going on. And I agree with that. It needs to be liberalized somewhat, but the protections need to be there because at the end of the day, that's what protects most of us from scams, enables us to get our money back. More importantly, it protects the infrastructure and the integrity of the system, which is where the reasons we bank with. One reason guys still use loads is because, they're loads. And you keep the money, it's safe, it's always going to be there. It might not be flexible in a lot of things, but you for long-term savings or a point like that, it's well worth it.
I'm actually not just not a speech on that, like a lot of the things like is subject to counterparty risk, where we're talking about basically self-custody crypto versus the digital banking system. And I basically like said that, look, at the end of the day, whatever transaction you're doing, you're always subject to the counterparty risk. And so that sense, traditional banks, do offer that additional security because just they've been around, for a long time.
Yeah. And something you just mentioned there with the crypto, for example, we see a lot of traditional UK banks don't want to touch anything.
Yeah.
They won't even take your withdrawals from your trading, even from a platform. Do you see this is why Revolut maybe is moving into the MENA space where, for example, you can come to Dubai and you can buy an apartment on the same day with crypto and everyone's happy. Whereas in Europe, you've got to go through so many jumps of hurdles, purchase of funds. There's always a suspicion of somebody. So do you see maybe that's the reason why the digitalization in MENA is happening, because of that liberalized approach to the crypto and the currency options as well?
I think so. Again, I don't want to speak on behalf of, UK regulator, but, there is sort of the fear comes from lack of knowledge. And it's obviously new, but no, the SEC, for example, approves crypto ETF. So I do think it's just a matter of time. I think industries and countries that have jumped on this trend earlier, are natural beneficiaries. And I think we've seen a lot of the U.S. family offices, the high net worth individuals, a lot of people moving to here. And I think obviously that's in response to the flexibility. So yeah, I do think that, digitalization, is going to be a massive driver. And I think for companies like Revolut, is going to be another venue to onboard more customers on tonight.
Yeah, so we're talking about the digitalization, obviously MENA, and we're talking about Dubai, but we also have North Africa and the other region. So you're seeing countries like Morocco, Tunisia, obviously very much open, quicker even than Dubai was. But they're putting a very large focus on the financial literacy. So I know with Wise and these companies operating that, they have to not just have disclosures, but they have to provide, the clients have to rip help videos, how-to videos, just to make sure that the clients, and I know obviously from the Forex background, it's a very big push from us to bring our clients to the risk. Are you seeing the banks having to do this as well? And do you see them having to move into the space the more retail, let's say they become?
Well, from a Europe experience, I see that sort of onboarding is becoming, less onerous. It used to be with traditional banks, it still is. There's paperwork, there's documents. But with the likes of Revolut or some other kind of new banks, it's essentially a passport, photograph, and a selfie. So I think it depends on the kind of level of risk, what's being offered. I do think that, if we're talking about leveraged instruments, there needs to be some sort of education. I don't think it's fair to kind of chuck the client through the door and sort of look, welcome. And because ultimately, if people are forced to do something they don't understand, then ultimately, you're not going to be able to generate sustainable business out of it.
And we're talking about leverage. Even with someone like Revolut, Wise, these kind of options, and even if you're looking then into other providers who are in the market space, a lot of them are providing unleveraged products as well, which in a lot of cases can be even more risky than the leverage because you're using full equity assets. So I agree with you on that financial literacy, making it more clear to people.
Yeah.
The one thing that comes around, obviously, in the banking sector and something that's always discussed, I mentioned Lloyd's there. One of the reasons I bank with them is their ISA program, what I get on interest, which then leads into the MENA market with Islamic financing and that. How do you see that aspect developing? Because banks and financial institutions, whether a traditional merchant brick operation or an EMI, are based around that 200, 300-year model of I take your money, I use that as collateral to loan, I pay you a small interest, but I make the gap. How do you see the banks who are moving into this area taking that traditional approach and adapting it to the Islamic market?
I think the Islamic financing needs to be taken into account. Obviously, we in the Forex, CFD industry, we have always kind of had some sort of offering or account, whether it's an account type or a product around that. I think it needs to be taken into account, interest rates, how do you go around that? I think you can't just sort of expect the same, European, US sort of the percent, annual interest type model, to work here. I think you'll have to look up how to offer it at the same time, make sure that you don't offer the product for free. So I think the product will need to be adapted. So which form? Obviously I can speak on behalf of the industry. We know all sorts of, waiving the charges or, modifying or making them more of an upfront sort of, fee-based approach. I think something around that will have to be done, in the banks of the new banks that are moving into this area as well.
Well, I think that's it. I think it's obviously utilizing your traditional business model, but with small adaptations.
Right.
Very much like the trading market and the CFD markets had to do with coming in, which is fantastic. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, Pavel. It's been great to speak. I'm going to be back in around 20 minutes with our next video.